Feel very welcome to
Thank
Stockholm,
you.
Kim.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours now.
Thanks, my pleasure. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk with you today about designing the way that we design. Some years ago, one of my teams was working on a medical project, big scary machines that zap cancer cells with radiation. And the CEO at this company had recently fallen in love with his iPhone. And one of the things that he said to me was, make the interface like my iPhone. Make it pretty and fun to play with. This is a machine that zaps people with radiation. We all know why that's probably not appropriate, but I bet you've all heard similar things, right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, we want to put the Microsoft Office ribbon in our application, or my favorite, make my website just like Amazon. Now, chances are, if you've heard this, you offered the same response that I did, which is, you can't really take a design that was developed in one context, pick it up and plop it in another context and expect it to work. Everything we do is about context. So given that, let's consider what we do at conferences like this, the conversations that we have on Twitter. We talk to each other about our projects and our methods. We share our frustrations about all the barriers that we have in projects, things like not enough budget or not enough people and time or colleagues who are difficult. And we share advice with each other. And yet there's something missing often from that advice, and that's context. Why would we think that doing UX one way in one organization means that's going to work in another organization? So what I'd like to talk with you today about is how can the cultural context of the organizations we work with, whether we're employees or consultants, how can that cultural context drive the way we approach our projects? Because I think if we design our behavior for our work context, we're going to be more successful. That's because project issues that we tend to run into, all of those things about not enough resources and resistance from colleagues and things like that, those are all really symptoms. So the real issue is culture. The real thing that's driving all of those is the culture of the organization. And I don't mean, can you wear jeans to the office, or are you in Sweden or Norway or Denmark? What I mean is the shared assumptions in that organization and the systems and the artifacts that reinforce all those assumptions. Now, these are assumptions because they're invisible, like water to a fish. We live and breathe these things every day. There are a lot of assumptions about what matters in that organization, assumptions about who matters, assumptions about things that we can and can't do and what behavior is acceptable. And these are largely invisible to us. They're hard to detect because we live with them every day. And if you're a consultant, they're hard to detect because people don't talk about them openly, and you have to be around an organization for a little while to figure them out. Really, these things are values. They're deeply held beliefs that drive our decisions and our behavior. Now, organizational values matter a whole lot because our values are who we are. They become the user experience. There's an interesting book called The Disney Way, worth a good airplane read if you have some time. There's a story in there about how several people check into one of the Disney resort hotels. And shortly after, they hop on a bus to go somewhere else in the park. And the bus driver says, hey, you're staying at one of our hotels. How's your room? And one of the people on the bus says, my faucet is dripping, and I forgot to tell the front desk about that. And the bus driver says, what's your room number? I'll get it taken care of for you. The guy tells him. And then when he gets back to his room, it's taken care of. The bus driver. The bus driver has been trained to believe that his job is not to drive a bus. His job is to give guests a great experience. Now, can you imagine that happening in most places? Somebody taking responsibility for something that you wouldn't think is part of their job description? No, not so much. It's culture. It's about the values of the organization. Let's contrast this with somebody I tend to spend a lot of time with, United Airlines. United Airlines in the US is known for some customer service challenges. And so recently, they revived an ad campaign that's, 20, 30 years old, Fly the Friendly Skies. and they are getting ridiculed in the press and in the forums. People are saying, friendly skies? Are you joking? Are you tone deaf? Because the thing is, you can't fake values. You can claim that something is your value, but people look at what you do. They look at how you behave, and that's how they know who you are. So, what this means is, as a group of professionals, we all have certain values that we share, things like respecting our users' time and dignity, delight, efficiency, clarity, usability, learnability, accessibility. We all value these things, and we would probably like to think that our organizations do too. We would like to think that these are the things that drive our projects. Not so much. If we're honest with ourselves, we will admit that actually there's a different engine driving most of our projects. The organization's core values are the things that we have to hitch our trailer to, so to speak, because something else is actually the engine that's pulling those projects along. Something else is going to drive what decisions get made. And what those values are might really vary quite a bit from organization to organization. If you're in e-commerce, maybe that value is all about getting the transaction. If you're in IT, maybe that value is about protecting the data. If you're in other kinds of organizations, maybe it's about enabling the salespeople, or there may be a whole host of things. And what it says on the poster on the wall is your value may not be the real value that's driving things there. So we have to figure out what those underlying values are and really pitch the UX to those and talk about how we support those. Now, finding the real values is tricky. A couple of places I tend to look for them. One is in origin stories. I remember meeting with the CEO of a big software company once, and he was telling me, in a clearly very well-rehearsed way, about how he coded the first version of that product sitting on a milk crate in his garage. It was very clear that the idea of engineer as inventor was deeply held in this organization. And in hindsight, I realized that had our teams respected that more and really worked with them more around that value, we probably would have succeeded more with that company than we did at the time. The other big place to look for values is in where does the money go? Where do people spend their time and their attention? How many of you have heard, we don't have time or money to do user research? Okay, quite a few hands. The thing that really gets me is people state that as if it's a fact. They look at you with a straight face and they say, we don't have time, we don't have money. That is not true. There is time and there is money, it's just going somewhere else. That's not a statement of fact, it's a statement of values. So we have to pay attention to these things, and some of these values we need to work on changing, but that's challenging. Now, the first thing we have to do is question the values. When someone tells you you can't do something or we have to do something a certain way, you want to question that and figure out, is this just your individual value, or is this a value that we all share? Is this an organizational value, and is it appropriate? We have to make pests of ourselves a little bit. Now, the other thing that we have to do is figure out, once we understand the values, how can we use those? How can we work with them instead of fighting them? Because it is possible to change organizational values, but that's a multi-year project. It takes time, it takes commitment, it takes executive support in a big way. So the first step ought to be figuring out how do we work with the values in a sort of a martial arts fashion. So one of the most important sets of values to look at is values around decision making. So if we're used to using personas to drive our design, well, what if there were sets of values that could drive how we craft our project plans? Organizational archetypes, if you will. Well, I found one model a few years back that I find really useful in considering this. It's called the Competing Values Framework. So Cameron and Quinn argue that organizations, and they've studied quite a few around the globe, make decisions based on a couple of axes. One is whether they're very accustomed to change and see that as a good thing. The other is whether they drive towards stability. Do they really seek that out? The other axis is whether they tend to be internally focused when they think about improvement, or do they tend to look outside of the organization? And they argue that based on this, there are basically 4 organizational archetypes, types of cultures around decision making. And if we can learn to work with these, I think it makes our projects a whole lot more effective. Now, real organizations, of course, are a blend of these influences. But what you'll find is that most organizations tend to be dominated by one of these styles, maybe two, but usually just one of them. And of course, a big organization that's very complex, different parts of the organization could have different styles. So I want to introduce you to each of those styles and some ways that I've found are helpful to work with them. So the first is called an adhocracy. Sort of a weird made-up word, but if you know your Latin, it basically means we make stuff up as we go along. Okay? So adhocracies tend to be very change-oriented. They tend to look outside of themselves for inspiration. Now, if you work in an adhocracy, some frustrations that might be familiar to you are generally a lack of process. Things tend to be chaotic. People don't approach a project the same way twice. There's a lot of blurriness about roles. It's sort of unclear who does what. In fact, you might not even have job titles sometimes in an adhocracy. Lack of ownership. And if you start saying, I want to institute a new design process, there's going to be an allergic reaction to that. So I find this culture a whole lot in startups. It's very common there. Adhocracies value experimentation. They value the idea that they can respond to the market quickly. They value the idea that they're going to try things and fail and learn. And so they value people with vision. An adhocracy often is started by an entrepreneur, somebody who sees the world differently from everybody around them. And they're frustrated because not everybody else sees what they see. So if you can help them see that more clearly and help other people see their vision, they're going to value you tremendously. Adhocracies also tend to value generalists. If you say, hey, I'm kind of an all-purpose design, a little bit of research, a little bit of usability testing, I can do some of everything, they're going to love you. If you say, I specialize in remote usability testing of responsive mobile websites, they're going to look at you like, what planet are you from? In my experience, adhocracies respond well to a UX professional as whiteboard ninja. This is in some ways your most valuable skill in an adhocracy. Your ability to quickly say, let's take this amorphous idea and make it concrete so everybody can look at it and pick it apart and we can show it to users and get feedback. They'll look at your sketches like you're magical. They get all excited. You did a sketch. It's so cool. So you want to maximize the sketching, you want to maximize the user feedback, and you want to minimize talk about process. Doesn't mean you can't use process, but just don't use the word. It's kind of like putting spinach in your kid's food. Just don't tell them it's there. Now, clan cultures are very different. They're still change-oriented, but they're much more inwardly focused. One way you can recognize a clan culture is meetings by committee. It's impossible to make a decision with just one or two people in the room. You need at least 8. Nobody wants to own that decision, and they think everybody has a stake in that decision. It tends to feel like things move very slowly in a clan. Process is kind of painful. I see clans a lot in government organizations, education, sometimes in hospitals. They show up other places too, but they're very common there. There's no clear ownership. There's no one person who can make a decision without everybody around them getting upset. And conflict avoidance is pretty common as well. Sometimes in a clan culture, what I'll find is we'll have a meeting with all 18 people in it, and somebody will disagree with something, but it won't come up in the meeting, and then I'll hear about it 3 days later. Because, we want to keep everything cordial. So clans value people. They value people feeling valued. So employee satisfaction and involvement are huge. So the way to succeed as a UX professional in a clan organization is not to say I own the UX. It's to say we collectively own the UX. I just happen to have some tools that maybe not everybody else has. So being a coach and a facilitator is going to be well received in this kind of an organization. So this is the organization where you absolutely want to drag everybody out to those user interviews with you. In fact, you don't have to drag them because they'll want to come. They'll love it. Any kind of brainstorming meeting you can involve people in, that's going to be great. Now, this doesn't mean you have to have all 12 people in every meeting, but it does mean you need to be very clear with people about when are their feedback opportunities, when will they get to get involved. You want to minimize anything that makes people feel excluded in a clan. Now, a hierarchy is just what it sounds like. Very top-down organization, lots of structure. You see this in big, old companies fairly often. In fact, in my experience, companies tend to move kind of counterclockwise around this diagram. They start out as adhocracies. Later, they become hierarchies. Hierarchies tend to have fairly rigid process and roles. If it doesn't fit in the process diagram that's on every conference room wall, you can't do it. There are a lot of formal funding toll gates and things like that. Everybody knows who owns the project because, well, he's 4 levels up the org chart. You can see him. And they tend to be risk averse. So the idea of experimentation and failure sometimes are uncomfortable. So you have a lot of silos, lots of different departments who own different things and maybe don't talk to each other. Hierarchies value efficiency and structure. There's an operational reason why they value those things. And so what we have to do as UX professionals is help them understand that UX can be a repeatable process. We can make it feel like a thing that we're not making up as we go along. And we can show them how our work informs different decision points and reduces risk. If there's one organization that actually will say, you're the UX professional, go do your job, it's going to be a hierarchy. If there's one kind of organization where a style guide actually works, it's going to be a hierarchy. They tend to value us as process mavens. They tend to value us as experts in our roles. So, in a hierarchy, we want to maximize people's understanding that, yeah, our process actually doesn't completely break the process, it just amends it a little bit. We want to formalize things in a hierarchy. We want to make sure that we're very explicit about the decision points. And we want to emphasize the ways in which we reduce risk. The last culture I want to talk to you about is called a market culture. Sort of a strange name. What it means is that they're market focused. They look externally a lot. Google, a lot of stories I hear from folks who work there make it sound very much like a market culture. Some of the challenges in this sort of place are prove it. If you say, this design will make something better, they're not really going to believe you until you can show that, which is challenging sometimes because until you build it, you don't always know. But this is definitely a place where usability test data and case studies from other places and so on are valued. They tend to have a lot of focus on competitors, so there's a Me Too effect sometimes in a market culture, sometimes detrimentally so. And there's really an emphasis on going fast, and the idea of going slow to go fast is sort of alien in places like this, so there's a lot of time pressure. Market cultures value near-term profit. They're so measurement-oriented that if the change you want to make isn't really visible and measurable in the short term, it's a tougher argument. So an architectural change or an overall change that's not measurable, you really have to put a lot of oomph behind it to get that through. So in a market culture, we need to be scientists. We need to really use data to our advantage. If you're in the web, you have an advantage here because you have analytics at your disposal. I think that if you have more of a desktop product, you have to look elsewhere for that kind of data. Look at the customer support logs and things like that to back up your arguments, because the more you can quantify, the more credible you'll be. So we want to emphasize data, and we want to minimize time and risk. So any place you can look for efficiency, you might have to demonstrate the difference between one project approach and another. Any place you can remove risk is going to be appreciated in a market culture. So if you think about these as archetypes for whom we can design project plans, you would approach a project differently in a market culture than you would in a hierarchy or in an adhocracy. And I find this really works. I had a client one time who I initially thought was an adhocracy. And so I was really emphasizing the sketches and changing quickly on the project and so on. And then I realized, we're revisiting every decision 3 times. Something is wrong here. And I realized, they're much more clan-like than I realized. And then I started inviting about 8 more people to every check-in meeting. And you know what? Things moved along at a nice clip after that. So really think about the culture you're in and talk about that with your team. So you want to be a pest. You want to question the values. You want to poke at those and see, are they really the right ones for us? You want to work with the values that the organization has. Adapt your approach to design to the culture that you're working in. And finally, you want to make sure that you're not completely ruled by culture. Just because you're working in an adhocracy, that doesn't mean they can't benefit from a little bit of structure. Clans need some role definition. In a clan, you can drive the design primarily, But you have to be very careful that the way you do it doesn't exclude people. So you have to be really explicit about, here are the ways I'm going to involve you throughout the project. Show people a project plan and all of their specific involvement points so that they feel very heard. In an adhocracy, absolutely they need process. But the way I tend to talk about process in an adhocracy isn't to use the P word. It's to say, hey, I have an idea. Let's go talk to some users first. And then from that, we can sketch some ideas about what might work and see what the users think of that. And then we can work on the details. How does that sound? Well, that's process. It just doesn't sound like it, so it's okay. And then people will try it and say, oh, that kind of worked. That was good. And before you know it, it'll become our standard process. So hierarchies do need a little bit of disruption. The thing is, you have to frame that disruption in a way that feels safe and feels like part of the process. So, for example, I was working with a medical device company, and the Food and Drug Administration in the US regulates the heck out of the design process. But there's a point at which that things aren't regulated, and that's project inception. That's where you're starting to come up with ideas. And so the design team in this company was having a really hard time experimenting at all. And so what we did was we inserted a stage before the inception phase that was the exploration phase, and we documented what it was, and we figured out that it could actually come before the regulated part, but because it was on the process poster, everybody felt good about it. So we put in disruption, we just structured how that disruption happened. And markets absolutely need more than numbers. Market folks will tell you, this is all about the data. It's all about the data. And I even had someone tell me once, the plural of anecdote is not data. And yet, I dragged that same guy out to a couple of user interviews. And boy, was he a believer. So, face-to-face time with users, getting out of the office, all these values that we have, that's absolutely essential with markets. So, a couple of things I'd suggest that you consider the rest of today. As you're listening to the speakers, as you're talking with your colleagues about the challenges you face, the successes you've had, share the context that you're working in. Ask about the context they're working in. When they're saying, hey, this works and that doesn't, consider what context they're coming from, and is that going to be true of your culture? Use that as a filter. When you go back to the office on Monday, talk as a team about, does one of these cultural archetypes fit our organization? And then in light of that, examine some of your recent projects. How have you approached things? Where have you run into trouble? Might it be that you're not approaching things based on the cultural context? Because other than lack of skill, that's the number one cause I see of teams struggling to get their projects built. And think about how you might adapt that approach next time. And then finally, in the long term, think about whether the values in your organization fit your values. If they don't, and if you think that's a detriment to doing good user experience, you have a hard choice to make. You need to decide, am I committed enough to this organization to invest in changing some of those underlying values? It is possible, but it's a multi-year effort, takes a whole lot of work. Or can I not commit to that? Because if you can't, and if there's a conflict of values between you and the organization, you're going to get frustrated, you're not going to do your best work, and you're not going to serve anybody very well. Because when it comes down to it, our values are who we are, as people and as organizations. And we have to be true to them because we hold those values for a reason. So, food for thought. Thank you. Let me know what you think.